The most expensive mistake a person can make is believing someone else's uniform reveals the limits of their worth. On a rain-soaked Thursday evening, every crystal chandelier inside Hawthorne House shimmered like liquid gold, reflecting across polished marble floors where Manhattan's wealthiest diners gathered to celebrate deals worth more than most neighborhoods. Every table seemed occupied by executives, investors, celebrities, and politicians whose conversations floated gently beneath the soft melody of a grand piano. White-gloved servers moved almost invisibly through the room, their footsteps silent, their timing flawless, each one trained to disappear the moment a guest no longer needed them. Among them was Claire Bennett, 28 years old, blonde hair neatly tied into a simple bun, calm blue eyes, a crisp black uniform pressed so perfectly it looked untouched by the 12-hour shift already behind her. She carried herself with quiet confidence, never rushing, never demanding attention, never speaking louder than necessary. Most guests never remembered her face after leaving. Claire preferred it that way. At precisely 7:15 p.m., the atmosphere changed before anyone announced his arrival. The maitre d' straightened his jacket. Two managers quietly stepped toward the entrance. Conversations softened as a tall man in a charcoal suit entered the dining room with the effortless certainty of someone accustomed to every room adjusting itself around him. Nathaniel Brooks, founder of Brooks Capital, Billionaire, 40 under 40 cover star. Every financial network seemed to quote him daily. His watch alone could have purchased several homes in the Midwest, yet nothing about his expression suggested satisfaction. His eyes scanned the restaurant with clinical precision, measuring efficiency the same way he evaluated balance sheets. Success had become less of an achievement and more of an expectation. Table 12 had been reserved exclusively for him. Claire approached carrying a leather-bound menu and a glass of sparkling water. "Good evening, Mr. Brooks. Welcome back." Her voice remained warm but measured. Nathaniel barely looked up from the message. Glowing across his phone, "Still the same waitress." The words weren't cruel. They were dismissive, casual, as if she were another piece of furniture. Claire simply placed the glass beside him with practiced precision. "Would you like a few minutes before ordering?" He nodded without lifting his eyes. Across the dining room, an elderly gentleman suddenly struggled to reach the cane resting against his chair after it slipped onto the polished floor. Before any other server noticed, Claire quietly crossed the room, retrieved it with both hands, and offered it back with a gentle smile. The older man thanked her softly. She nodded once and returned to her duties without expecting recognition. Nathaniel had watched the entire exchange. His meeting had already been delayed twice that afternoon. His investors were late. His patience had nearly disappeared. When Claire returned to ask whether he was ready to order, his attention remained fixed on his phone as she politely waited. Several seconds passed, then another. Finally, without warning, he looked directly into her eyes for the first time. His voice remained perfectly controlled, calm enough that almost everyone nearby heard every single word. "Know your place." The silverware stopped clinking. Even the piano seemed quieter. Claire didn't answer. She didn't flinch. She simply held his gaze for one silent heartbeat before giving the smallest professional nod. "Of course, Mr. Brooks," she said gently. She turned and walked away with exactly the same steady pace she'd carried all evening. No anger, no embarrassment, no explanation. Nathaniel believed the moment was over. He had no idea that within the next few minutes, the entire restaurant would witness a lesson neither money nor power had ever managed to teach him. Claire continued through the dining room exactly as she had before, carrying fresh coffee, replacing folded napkins, answering quiet requests, and thanking every guest with the same gentle professionalism that had become second nature after years of invisible work. If anyone expected tears, anger, or even wounded pride, they found none. Her expression remained composed, almost peaceful, as though the word she had just heard had dissolved into the background noise of clinking glasses and polite conversation. A young busser named Ethan hurried beside her, his face flushed with concern. "Claire, are you okay?" he whispered while stacking dessert plates onto his tray. She offered him a reassuring smile. "I am fine." Table 8 is waiting for their coffee refill. Ethan looked back toward Table 12, where Nathaniel Brooks had already returned to reviewing financial reports on his phone. "He should not have talked to you like that." Claire gently adjusted the folded linen on Ethan's tray before handing it back. "Everyone carries something you cannot see. Do not let one difficult moment become your whole evening." Ethan blinked, surprised that she sounded more worried about him than herself. He nodded quietly and returned to work. From across the room, the restaurant manager, Olivia Carter, had witnessed the exchange with growing unease. She had managed Hawthorne House for nearly 15 years and knew the value of difficult clients. Nathaniel Brooks was not simply wealthy. His company hosted annual dinners there that generated more revenue in 1 week than many restaurants earned in months. She approached Claire cautiously near the service station. "If you would like, I can assign someone else to his table." Claire shook her head almost immediately. "There is no need. He is still our guest." Olivia studied her carefully. Most people would not stay this calm. Claire smiled faintly while polishing a wine glass until it reflected the chandelier above. "Calm is usually less expensive than pride." Olivia said nothing. She had hired hundreds of employees over the years, but there was always something different about Claire. She never complained. She never competed for attention. She somehow made nervous coworkers feel capable and impatient guests feel heard without raising her voice. Nobody knew much about her life outside the restaurant because she rarely spoke about herself. Whenever conversations turned personal, she redirected them towards someone else with genuine curiosity. To many people, she seemed almost ordinary. Yet the longer someone worked beside her, the more impossible that description became. Meanwhile, Nathaniel glanced up again, expecting to see signs that his comment had unsettled her. Instead, he found Claire kneeling beside a small table where a little boy had accidentally dropped his coloring pencils across the floor. She gathered every pencil, organized them by color without being asked, and returned them with a smile that made the child laugh. Moments later, she noticed an elderly couple quietly sharing one dessert to celebrate what appeared to be an anniversary. Without interrupting them, she asked the pastry chef for 2 extra forks and arranged a tiny candle beside their plate. No announcement, no applause, just a thoughtful gesture that brightened 2 grateful faces. Nathaniel watched each interaction with growing curiosity. None of it looked rehearsed. None of it seemed performed for recognition. She moved through the dining room with the quiet confidence of someone who believed every person deserved the same respect regardless of the size of the check resting on the table. He found himself lowering his phone for the first time that evening. Numbers, contracts, and market forecasts suddenly felt strangely distant. Something about Claire Bennett refused to fit into the category he had assigned her only minutes earlier. And although he could not explain why, he began paying closer attention, unaware that the evening was quietly arranging a revelation neither of them could stop. Nathaniel Brooks had built an empire by trusting measurable facts instead of first impressions. Yet first impressions had quietly become one of his greatest weaknesses. Every company he acquired had been reduced to spreadsheets before he ever shook a hand. Every executive he promoted had survived countless performance reviews. Every partnership was tested, challenged, and negotiated until every possible risk disappeared. That relentless discipline had earned him respect on Wall Street and admiration from business schools across the country. It had also convinced him that he could evaluate people within seconds. The tailored suit, the confident handshake, the expensive watch, the polished resume. To Nathaniel, those details often revealed more than words ever could. They had become shortcuts that saved time, or so he believed. His executive assistant, Daniel Foster, arrived several minutes late after finishing a call with investors in California. "I apologize for the delay," Daniel said quietly while taking his seat across the table. Nathaniel barely acknowledged him. "The acquisition documents." Daniel slid a leather portfolio across the table. "Everything is ready for tomorrow morning." Nathaniel flipped through several pages with remarkable speed. Every figure seemed to register instantly. Every misplaced decimal caught his attention. "Page 14, he said calmly. The operating margin calculation should read 12.6%, not 12.4. Daniel looked surprised before checking the page. Nathaniel was correct. I missed that. Nathaniel closed the folder. That is why details matter. Daniel nodded respectfully. He had worked beside Nathaniel for almost 8 years and admired his extraordinary discipline. But he also understood that success had slowly built invisible walls around him. Nathaniel trusted competence. He respected excellence. Yet somewhere along the journey, he had begun associating professional titles with personal value. Across the dining room, Claire continued serving guests with the same steady rhythm. Nathaniel found his attention drifting toward her again despite trying to focus on the meeting. He noticed how every employee naturally sought her advice whenever small problems appeared. A nervous new server quietly asked her how to open an expensive bottle of wine without disturbing the guests. Claire demonstrated the proper technique with patient precision before handing the bottle back with an encouraging smile. Minutes later, a hostess struggled to rearrange seating after an unexpected reservation arrived. Claire calmly suggested moving 2 nearby tables without inconveniencing anyone. Within moments, the problem disappeared so smoothly that none of the waiting guests realized anything unusual had happened. Daniel noticed Nathaniel watching the dining room instead of the financial reports. "Everything all right?" Nathaniel answered without taking his eyes off Claire. "Interesting employee." Daniel glanced toward her. "Claire Bennett." Nathaniel looked over. "You know her name?" Daniel smiled. "My parents celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary here last month. She organized the entire evening after learning it was their first dinner out since my father recovered from heart surgery. She never accepted an extra tip. She simply said that kindness travels farther than money." Nathaniel remained silent. Daniel continued speaking without realizing how carefully his employer was listening. "My mother still talks about her. She said Claire made them feel like the only people in the restaurant." Nathaniel looked back toward Claire as she quietly placed fresh bread on another table before noticing a guest searching for reading glasses beneath a chair. She found them almost immediately and handed them back with a warm smile that carried no trace of the humiliation he had caused earlier. The contrast unsettled him more than he expected. He had spent decades mastering negotiations, mergers, and billion-dollar decisions. Yet he could not explain why one quiet waitress seemed completely untouched by the opinion of the richest man in the room. For the first time in years, Nathaniel began questioning not who Claire Bennett really was, but whether he had been looking at people through the wrong lens all along. He did not realize the answer was already walking toward table 12, carried by someone whose arrival would change the entire evening. The front entrance opened once again, but this time no one rushed to greet the arriving guest. The man who stepped inside wore a simple navy blazer instead of an expensive tailored suit. His silver hair was neatly combed, and he carried himself with the quiet ease of someone who no longer felt the need to impress anyone. Most diners barely noticed him. Claire did. Before the hostess could even reach the entrance, she walked over with a genuine smile that seemed warmer than professional courtesy alone. "Good evening, Mr. Whitmore. It is wonderful to see you again." The older gentleman smiled immediately. "And it is wonderful to see you too, Claire. I was hoping you would be working tonight." Claire carefully helped him remove his raincoat before leading him toward a small table near the window. "Your usual tea?" she asked. He laughed softly. "You still remember." "Some things are worth remembering," she replied. Nathaniel looked up from his meeting as the brief exchange caught his attention. There was nothing dramatic about it, yet it felt strangely different from every other interaction he had witnessed that evening. Claire was not performing exceptional service because the guest looked wealthy. She greeted the older man exactly the same way she had spoken to the little boy, the anniversary couple, and every other person who entered the restaurant. Daniel noticed Nathaniel watching again. "Do you know who that is?" Nathaniel shook his head. "Should I?" "That is Charles Whitmore." Nathaniel paused. The name sounded familiar, though he could not immediately place it. Daniel lowered his voice. "Retired federal judge. People say half the legal community in New York still asks for his advice." Nathaniel nodded once before returning to his documents. but his curiosity remained fixed on the quiet conversation unfolding across the room. Claire placed a steaming cup of chamomile tea in front of Judge Whitmore before setting a small ceramic plate beside it. On the plate rested a single slice of warm lemon cake. "I did not order dessert," the judge said with a puzzled smile. Claire gently folded her hands. "You mentioned last year that your late wife always ordered lemon cake whenever it rained. I thought tonight might be one of those evenings when a familiar memory feels comforting." For several seconds, the elderly man simply looked at the dessert without speaking. His eyes glistened under the chandelier light before he quietly smiled. "You remember conversations most people forget before they leave the table," Claire answered softly. "People deserve to feel remembered." Nathaniel stopped pretending to read the acquisition report. Across the dining room, he watched the older gentleman take a slow breath before thanking Claire with unmistakable sincerity. There was no publicity, no audience, no expectation of reward. Just simple kindness offered without calculation. Daniel followed Nathaniel's gaze. "You cannot teach people to do that," he said quietly. "Some people simply live that way." Nathaniel said nothing. For reasons he could not explain, he began replaying his own words from earlier in the evening. They sounded different now, smaller somehow. Before he could gather his thoughts, Olivia approached Claire with visible concern. One of the private dining rooms had encountered an unexpected problem involving a visiting charity board whose keynote guest had arrived ahead of schedule. Several employees looked uncertain. Claire listened carefully, nodded once, and calmly walked toward the private room without hesitation. Nathaniel watched her disappear through the wooden doors, unaware that within moments the quiet waitress he had dismissed would become the only person capable of preventing an evening meant to celebrate generosity from ending in public embarrassment. Inside the private dining room, the atmosphere had shifted from elegant anticipation to quiet uncertainty. Around a long walnut table sat members of the Emerson Children's Foundation, one of New York's oldest charitable organizations. Crystal glasses reflected the warm candlelight, but conversation had nearly disappeared. At the head of the table stood Olivia Carter, trying to reassure the guests while discreetly speaking with the event coordinator. Their keynote speaker had arrived unexpectedly early, and the presentation materials prepared for the evening contained a serious mistake. A donor who had quietly contributed millions of dollars over the past decade had accidentally been omitted from the recognition program. No one wanted the oversight to become public. Olivia took a slow breath before turning toward Claire. "We only have a few minutes before everyone notices. I do not know how to fix this without embarrassing someone." Claire calmly accepted the printed program and read every page with remarkable focus. She did not rush. She did not panic. After less than 30 seconds, she looked up with quiet confidence. "Do not announce the list yet." Olivia blinked. "What?" Claire pointed toward the welcome display near the entrance. "Move the recognition to the closing remarks instead of the opening. During dinner, print one corrected page and replace the inserts before dessert is served." Most guests have not opened their programs yet because they are still arriving. The coordinator stared at her in disbelief. "That would actually work." Claire nodded gently. "It protects the donor, avoids embarrassing the organizers, and keeps the schedule almost exactly the same." Olivia immediately began giving instructions. Within moments, employees hurried toward the business office while another manager quietly updated the evening's timeline. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody blamed anyone. The problem simply began disappearing. Nathaniel had unintentionally witnessed part of the conversation from the hallway while speaking with Daniel outside the private room. He recognized efficient decision-making when he saw it. Claire had analyzed a stressful situation faster than many executives sitting in corporate boardrooms. More surprising was what happened next. Once the solution had been accepted, Claire quietly handed the program back to Olivia and started walking toward the dining room. "Wait," Olivia called after her. "They are going to thank you." Claire smiled without stopping. "They do not need to know who suggested it. They only need the evening to succeed." She disappeared through the doorway before anyone could respond. Nathaniel remained standing in the hallway, watching her return to serving guests as though nothing unusual had happened. She did not pause to admire her own solution. She did not expect recognition. She simply picked up a fresh tray of coffee and resumed her work with the same steady rhythm she had maintained all evening. Daniel folded his arms thoughtfully. Most people spend their lives trying to be noticed. Nathaniel answered quietly, almost to himself. She seems to spend hers making sure other people are. Back in the main dining room, Judge Charles Whitmore observed Claire passing his table once more. He smiled knowingly before turning his attention toward Nathaniel for the briefest moment. Their eyes met across the room. The retired judge offered a subtle expression that Nathaniel could not quite interpret. It was neither approval nor criticism. It looked more like patient expectation, as though the older man already understood something Nathaniel had not yet discovered. The rain continued tapping softly against the tall windows while the restaurant settled back into its graceful rhythm. But beneath the calm elegance of the evening, invisible threads were drawing several lives together toward a truth that could no longer remain hidden. As dinner progressed, the tension that had quietly settled over Nathaniel Brooks began giving way to something unfamiliar. It was not guilt, at least not yet. It was curiosity. He had built entire industries by asking the right questions, and for the first time that evening, none of the answers seemed obvious. Claire Bennett did not fit into any category he understood. She solved problems without seeking credit. She treated strangers like old friends. She accepted disrespect without surrendering her dignity. The pattern refused to make sense. While Daniel stepped outside to take another business call, Nathaniel remained alone at table 12, absent-mindedly stirring a cup of untouched coffee that had long since cooled. His attention drifted across the dining room once more. Judge Charles Whitmore had finished his tea and was preparing to leave. Before the elderly man reached the entrance, Claire hurried over with his folded raincoat already waiting in her hands. "The forecast says the rain may get heavier before 9, she said gently. "Please drive carefully." The judge smiled warmly. "You always think one step ahead, Claire." She laughed softly. "Someone has to." He accepted the coat, but did not immediately leave. Instead, he looked at her with quiet pride. "Have you ever considered that you spend too much time taking care of everyone else?" Claire shook her head. "Kindness is never wasted, Mr. Whitmore. It always finds its way back to someone who needs it." The judge nodded thoughtfully before glancing toward Nathaniel's table. After a brief pause, he walked directly across the dining room. Nathaniel stood politely as the distinguished older man approached. "Judge Whitmore," he said respectfully, "it has been a long time." "Too long," the judge replied with a friendly smile. "I have followed your career. Remarkable accomplishments." Nathaniel thanked him modestly before noticing that the judge's attention had shifted toward Claire, who was quietly assisting another guest several tables away. "She is exceptional," Nathaniel admitted. "I have never seen a waitress handle an evening like this." Judge Whitmore looked back at him with calm eyes that carried decades of wisdom. "That is because you are still calling her a waitress." Nathaniel frowned slightly. "Is that not what she is?" The older man smiled, though there was sadness behind it. "It is what she does. It is not who she is." Nathaniel remained silent. Judge Whitmore continued speaking carefully, choosing every word with the precision of someone accustomed to weighing truth before offering it. "Several years ago, after my wife passed away, I stopped speaking to almost everyone. I came here because sitting alone at home felt unbearable." Claire never asked personal questions. She simply remembered the little things. Which tea my wife preferred. Which table we always requested. The anniversary I forgot because grief had blurred every calendar. She reminded me that healing does not always arrive through grand speeches. Sometimes it arrives carrying a cup of tea. Nathaniel slowly looked toward Claire again. She was laughing softly with the little boy who had dropped his coloring pencils earlier, helping him choose the brightest blue crayon for a drawing of the rainy skyline outside. Judge Whitmore spoke one final sentence before putting on his coat. "Young man, the easiest way to misunderstand someone is to mistake their occupation for their identity." Without waiting for a response, he offered Nathaniel a courteous handshake and quietly left the restaurant. Nathaniel remained standing beside his chair long after the front door had closed. Outside, the rain continued falling across the city. Inside, the words of a retired judge settled deeper than any business lesson he had ever learned, while Claire Bennett, completely unaware of the conversation, continued, serving every table with the same quiet grace that had never depended on anyone's approval. The evening was drawing closer to its final course, yet the energy inside Hawthorne House felt different now. The conversations had become warmer, the laughter more natural, and the steady rhythm of silverware against fine china blended softly with the rain beyond the tall windows. Claire moved through the dining room exactly as she always had, unaware that more than one pair of eyes now followed her with quiet admiration instead of casual indifference. Nathaniel Brooks no longer reached for his phone every few minutes. The acquisition documents remained closed beside his untouched coffee. For perhaps the first time in years, he was observing people instead of transactions. Olivia Carter approached table 12, carrying the evening's dessert menu. Before Nathaniel could speak, he asked a question that surprised even himself. "How long has Claire worked here?" Olivia smiled faintly. "Almost 6 years." Nathaniel looked genuinely surprised. 6 years? Someone with her judgment could be running a company. Olivia glanced toward Claire before answering. "Many people have tried to convince her to leave." "She refused?" Nathaniel asked. "Every time." Nathaniel leaned back slightly. "What?" Olivia paused, as though searching for the right words. "Because she says this job lets her serve people in ways that titles never could." Nathaniel remained silent. Olivia continued with a gentle smile. "You know, every December our staff votes for the employee who best represents the spirit of the restaurant." Nathaniel nodded politely. "Let me guess. Claire wins." Olivia laughed softly. "She asked us not to announce it anymore." Nathaniel frowned. "Why would anyone refuse recognition?" "Because she believes kindness loses something when it becomes a competition." Those words lingered in the air long after Olivia returned to her duties. Nathaniel slowly turned his attention toward Claire once again. A businessman accidentally spilled sparkling water across the tablecloth while reaching for his briefcase. Before embarrassment could spread across the table, Claire calmly replaced the linens, reassured the guests that accidents happened every day, and somehow transformed an awkward moment into shared laughter. Moments later, she noticed the little boy from earlier struggling to zip his rain jacket before leaving with his parents. She knelt beside him, patiently helped him fasten the zipper, and sent him into the rainy night with a cheerful wave. Neither family realized that Nathaniel had witnessed every small gesture. Daniel returned from his call and quietly took his seat. "The investors agreed to tomorrow's terms," he said. Nathaniel barely reacted. His attention remained fixed across the room. "Daniel," he asked thoughtfully, "when was the last time someone impressed you without mentioning their accomplishments?" Daniel smiled almost immediately. "It happens more often than people think." Nathaniel nodded slowly. "Perhaps I have been looking in the wrong places." At that exact moment, the charity board from the private dining room began leaving after a successful event. Several members stopped to thank Olivia for the flawless evening. One elderly woman carrying a silver cane noticed Claire arranging fresh flowers near the entrance. She walked directly toward her and gently took both of Claire's hands. "You probably do not remember me," the woman said warmly. Claire smiled with quiet certainty. "Dr. Eleanor Hayes. We met at the community literacy fundraiser 3 years ago. You recommended the history books for the children's reading corner." The woman's eyes widened with delighted surprise. "You remembered." Claire laughed softly. "You told me every child deserves one adult who believes they can learn anything. I never forgot." Dr. Hayes turned toward the people standing nearby, including Nathaniel, and spoke with heartfelt sincerity. "Young lady, I have met senators, judges, university presidents, and famous authors. Very few remember people the way you do." Claire simply lowered her eyes with humble gratitude. Everyone deserves to feel seen. The small group fell completely silent. Nathaniel felt those 5 simple words settle more heavily than any speech he had ever heard. In that quiet moment, surrounded by wealth, influence, and achievement, the person commanding the deepest respect was the only one in the room who had never asked for it. The last guests lingered over coffee and quiet conversation while the rain outside softened into a gentle mist. Inside Hawthorne House, the golden light seemed warmer than it had only an hour earlier. Claire gathered empty cups from a nearby table with the same calm efficiency that had defined her entire evening. She did not notice Nathaniel Brooks rise from his chair. Daniel looked up in surprise as his employer closed the leather portfolio containing tomorrow's acquisition documents and pushed it aside. Without saying a word, Nathaniel walked across the dining room. Several employees instinctively stepped back, assuming another request was coming. Olivia paused near the service station. Ethan stopped polishing silverware. Even the pianist allowed the final notes of a familiar melody to fade naturally into silence. Claire turned only when she sensed someone standing beside her. She looked up and found Nathaniel waiting quietly, his expression completely different from the one he had worn when he first arrived. There was no impatience in his eyes now, no superiority, only thoughtful humility. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Nathaniel finally broke the silence. "Miss Bennett, may I have a moment of your time?" Claire nodded politely. "Of course, Mr. Brooks." He took a slow breath, fully aware that nearby conversations had stopped. The words he wanted to say felt strangely heavier than any business presentation he had ever delivered. "Earlier this evening, I spoke to you in a way that no person deserves." Claire remained silent, giving him her full attention. Nathaniel continued. "I believed I understood who you were before I had learned a single thing about you. I confused your profession with your value. That was my mistake, not yours." The restaurant remained perfectly still. Olivia quietly lowered her eyes. Daniel watched without moving. Ethan held a stack of folded napkins against his chest. Nathaniel looked directly at Claire. "I owe you an apology." Claire's expression did not change. She simply listened. "Not because other people witnessed it," Nathaniel said. "Not because I am embarrassed. Because I was wrong." The sincerity in his voice left no room for performance. It sounded unfamiliar even to himself. Claire smiled gently, the same quiet smile she had offered guests throughout the evening. "Thank you for saying that." Nathaniel seemed almost surprised by the simplicity of her response. "You are not angry?" Claire shook her head softly. Holding on to anger usually hurts the person carrying it more than anyone else. Nathaniel lowered his eyes for a brief moment before speaking again. "I spent my career believing success meant staying above everyone else." Claire answered with calm kindness. "Real success helps other people stand beside you." Those words settled over the room like the final note of a beautiful song. No one interrupted. No one reached for a phone. It was simply two people having an honest conversation that somehow felt more important than every million-dollar discussion that had taken place inside the restaurant that year. Nathaniel reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a business card. "If you ever decide to leave this restaurant, I would be honored to speak with you about any position in my company." Claire looked at the card, but did not take it immediately. Instead, she smiled with quiet gratitude. "That is generous, Mr. Brooks." She accepted the card respectfully before adding, "But I hope you understand that where I work has never been the most important part of who I am." Nathaniel nodded slowly. "I understand that now." Around them, several guests exchanged thoughtful smiles. No applause filled the room. None was needed. The greatest change that evening had not happened to Claire Bennett. It had happened to the man who had finally learned that dignity cannot be measured by a title, purchased with wealth, or recognized by uniform alone. The restaurant slowly emptied until only the quiet sounds of closing remained. Chairs were carefully returned beneath polished tables. Crystal glasses caught the last golden reflections from the chandeliers before the lights were dimmed one by one. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, leaving the sidewalks glistening beneath the Manhattan skyline. Claire Bennett folded her apron with the same care she had shown every guest throughout the evening. For her, the shift had ended no differently than hundreds before it. She thanked Ethan for his hard work, wished Olivia a safe drive home, and smiled at the kitchen staff as they exchanged tired but grateful good nights. There was no celebration waiting for her. No dramatic announcement. No change in her job title. She slipped in her light gray coat, tucked a worn paperback novel into her shoulder bag, and quietly stepped toward the front entrance. Before she reached the door, she noticed the lemon cake on Judge Whitmore's table had been left unfinished. She smiled softly, remembering how much his late wife had loved rainy evenings, then carefully carried the remaining slice to the kitchen so nothing would be wasted. Even after everything that had happened, she was still thinking about someone else. Outside, the cool evening air carried the clean scent that always followed summer rain. Nathaniel Brooks stood beside the waiting black sedan that had remained parked along the curb for nearly an hour. His driver opened the rear door, but Nathaniel did not move. Instead, he watched Claire leave the restaurant alone, walking toward the subway station with calm, unhurried steps. She passed expensive cars without looking at them. She passed glowing storefronts without stopping. She carried herself with exactly the same quiet dignity she had shown while serving dinner. There was nothing to prove because she had never measured herself by what other people saw. Daniel stepped beside Nathaniel and followed his gaze. "You could still convince her to work for you," he said. Nathaniel slowly shook his head. "Perhaps." After a thoughtful pause, he added, "But I think she is already exactly where she wants to be." Daniel smiled. Not many people can say that. Nathaniel looked down at his own reflection in a rain puddle before answering. Not many people know who they are. The following Monday morning, employees at Brooks Capital arrived to find something unusual waiting in their inboxes. It was not a quarterly report. It was not an announcement about profits or acquisitions. It was a short message from their chief executive officer. It read, "Today, I was reminded that every person deserves respect before they earn admiration. We will continue pursuing excellence, but never at the expense of another person's dignity." Titles describe responsibilities. Character reveals identity. No explanation followed. No names were mentioned. Yet the people who knew Nathaniel best quietly recognized that something fundamental had changed. Weeks later, Nathaniel returned to Hawthorne House for another business dinner. The hostess welcomed him warmly and escorted him toward his table. Claire greeted him with the same professional smile she offered every guest. Nothing more, nothing less. Nathaniel smiled back with genuine gratitude. There was no awkwardness between them anymore, because respect no longer required words. As she prepared to leave the table, he simply said, "Good evening, Miss Bennett." She nodded warmly. "Good evening, Mr. Brooks. It is nice to see you again." Their conversation lasted only a few seconds, yet it carried more sincerity than all the expensive negotiations ever held inside those walls. Sometimes the greatest victories are invisible. No headlines announce them. No trophies celebrate them. They happen quietly, inside a human heart, when pride gives way to humility and judgment gives way to understanding. Because in the end, the uniform someone wears may explain what they do for a living, but only their character reveals who they truly are.